to the 19th Hayley-Roxanna Crafts quick cross stitch video, where I share information, hints and tips on one area of cross stitch in a short video. In this video I am focusing on how to do French knots. Like backstitching, French knots are another embroidery stitch used in cross stitching to add detail and interest to a design. They are also another stitch that some cross stitchers dread, as they can be tricky to get perfect. But sometimes this can be why we use them, and we shouldn't get too hung up on making them perfect. French knots are often added by designers here and there as finishing touches, and the places they are added often allow for them to be not perfect. This is how I show French knots on my charts. On other charts they may be shown as just a dot. I always show mine in the colour they are to be made in, even on the black and white chart. And I will include information detailing the threads and where the French knots are if there are multiple areas they are used in the chart in multiple different colours. Other designers may ask you to refer to a colour photo of the finished cross stitch in order to determine the colours if they've used multiple. When adding French knots to your cross stitch, the first thing to consider is how many strands to use. The knots here were all made with a different number of strands. So this was done with 1, then 2, 3, 4, 5 and 6. And as you can see, the more strands used, the larger the knot. Often the designer will specify how many strands to use for the French knots in their design. But if you need to decide for yourself, try out the number of strands on a scrap piece of fabric and see what you prefer. This may even vary project to project, as well as being subject to your personal preference. I have decided to use 2 strands to demonstrate French knots. To make your French knots, you first have to bring the needle up through your fabric where you want the knot to be. This could be through a hole, or it even could be through the fabric itself. So it literally could be anywhere. Okay, I'm going to bring it up through a hole for my demonstration. Like so. At this point, it is probably best to put your project down so that you can use both hands. You now need to decide how many times to wrap the thread around the needle. The higher the number of wraps you use, the bigger the knot will be. I often make a suggestion in the instructions for my designs on how many wraps to do, but I would advise trying a few different numbers out on a scrap of fabric to decide your preference. Like with the number of strands to use, the number of wraps may vary project to project, depending on the look you and the designer are going for. I will do 2 wraps today. So I just take my needle, grab hold of my thread near to my fabric, and then I'm just going to wrap it around the needle 1, 2 times, like that. Now you need to decide where to put the needle to take it back down through your fabric. This needs to be as close to where you came up without going through the same hole, so that the knot holds close to the fabric and doesn't flop about. So if I bring this up, this is quite tricky to show because I have to come up. I've undone it. Let's try that again. So 1, 2, and then I'm going to take my needle down just there. So there is literally a strand of the fabric between where I came up and where I'm going down. Lastly, as you pull the needle through, you need to think about the tension. You need to pull your thread tight enough that the wraps don't come loose, but not so tight that you can't pull your needle through. So you just want to hold it just so those wraps hug around that needle, and then very gently pull your needle through like so. And just keep your thumb on that thread as long as possible as you go. Pull, pull, pull. And there is the finished French knot. French knots can take some practice, But like I said at the beginning, try not to get too hung up on making them perfect. If you find it hard to pierce the fabric with the needle you are using, try a sharper needle. I have demonstrated French knots on Aida fabric, but they are done in the same way on even weave or any other fabric you may be using. If you have any questions about French knots, please pop them in the comments. In next week's video, I will demonstrate an alternative to French knots called colonial knots.